Everybody. So welcome to this evening's event. My name is James Crabtree from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy here in Singapore. I'll be your chairman for the next hour and 15 minutes. So it's my great pleasure this evening to launch this book, which I have a copy of here, the Routledge Handbook of China-India Relations, an extraordinary work of scholarship on one of the most important issues of the current moment, immensely timely given what has been going on in the Himalayas in the last couple of days. But as the authors of the volume argue, the second most consequential, at least the second most consequential relationship between great powers is detailed comprehensively in the volume. And so what we're going to do this evening is discuss some of the themes that are drawn out in its pages, which goes from the bilateral relationship in military and economic affairs, drawn from ancient history to the present day, to relations with countries like the United States and Russia, even to show how comprehensive it is, including a chapter on the relations between China and India in outer space. The editors conclude that India and China are not destined to clash, and that those who think that the two are destined for conflict, and that it may be a little bit more complicated than that, but to quote them, that India and China are entering a phase of intertwining intensity and complexity as never before. So that's what we're going to discuss this evening. Our order of play is that we're going to have an introduction to the current state of play between India and China from Kishore Mahbubani, who is a professor here at the National University of Singapore and the former dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School and author most recently of the book Has China Won? Then we're going to hear from three of the editors in quick succession, or the three editors, I should say. Assistant Professor Selina Ho from the Lee Kuan Yew School, Professor Kanti Bajpai, also from the Lee Kuan Yew School, and Associate Professor Marjorie Chatterjee from Boston University. And so the three of them have been slaving away to bring you this volume, and so they will talk a little bit about what they've done in putting together the essay collection and the themes that have come out of it. And then we'll have two short contributions, one from Professor Shending Li from Fudan University, who joins us from China this evening, and the second from Professor Tarun Khanna from Harvard University, who joins us from his porch in New England, as you can see in the early morning there. The only other things that I should say is that this event is a co-production this evening of the Lee Kuan Yew School and the Lakshmi, Mittal and Family South Asia Institute at Harvard University. So we're very grateful to them for their partnership. And for those of you watching, we're very grateful for you joining us this evening. You'll see that there's a question and answer button. And so if you want to ask questions for the authors, we'll leave about half an hour for questions after the discussion, or as much time as we can. So if you pop your questions into the Q&A, we'll get through as many of them as we can. Please let us know who you are. So if you put your name down and your designation, and that would be very helpful. We'll get through as many of those as we can. And we'll wrap up at about 9:45 Singapore time. So that's an hour and 15 for the total event. So with that, thank you very much again for joining us, and congratulations to Selina, to Marjorie, and to Kanti for this huge volume, which has taken a lot of work. But let's start now with Kishore. So Kishore, can you, in a sense, give us your sense of the outlook for China-India relations and the context in which this book has been produced, and how you think these are going? So let's hand over to you. Thank you very much, Kishore.
Thank you. Thank you very much, James, for having me on this occasion. But I'm going to begin with a rather paradoxical message. On the one hand, I'm very happy to participate here in the launch of this wonderful book. On the other hand, I feel very sad because the message I'm going to convey is a sad one. So the theme of my remarks, quite simply, is that relations between China and India are very bad, and they will get worse in the next 10 years. I wish I didn't have to say that, especially since I come from Singapore. And if there's one place in the world where Chinese and Indians live very happily with each other, I think there's no better place than Singapore. So many of our ministers, Indian ministers, have Chinese wives. And I can tell you that in the mid-1990s, when I was the permanent secretary of the Foreign Ministry of Singapore, one of the things that Singapore was so proud of was that we managed to get India as a dialogue partner of ASEAN and into the ASEAN Regional Forum. So our commitment to good relations with China and India are very profound. So this is why I feel very sad to see what's unraveling today. And what makes it even more sad is that the whole China-India issue has become so emotional. So emotional that it's very difficult to talk clinically and dispassionately about this subject. And I've encountered this. I've been on Indian TV shows where I've experienced this tremendous emotions coming out. So what I'm going to try and do today is to be very clinical and very analytical and say, for us, in geopolitics, it's a huge mistake to get emotional. It's always better to be dispassionate and objective. So let me explain the structural forces that are going to cause this deterioration in China-India relations I spoke about. There's several. One is, of course, shifts in power. Now, in 1980, the economies of China and India were about the same size. 2020, 40 years later, China's economy is almost 5 times the size of India. And size matters in geopolitics. And there's a correlation. Let me give you one story. Every time the Chinese and Indian diplomats talk to each other about the border issue, the Indian diplomats will ask the Chinese diplomats and say, you know, Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping offered us and said, why don't we just accept the line of control? The offer was last made in 1980 when the economy is about the same size. Today, when the Indians are asked the question, why don't you make that offer again? Chinese reply, why did you accept the offer in 1980? Well, that's a very telling comment. That's one issue, size. Second issue is technology. Now, Amartya Sen likes to say that China and India have lived in peace for thousands of years. It's true. Why? Because you had this huge mountain range called Himalayas, dividing China and India. Unfortunately, today, we have such good technology that China can build roads all the way up to the border. India can build roads all the way up to the border. And guess what? They can now confront each other face to face. Just a side note of technology, Kanti Bajpai has written a wonderful essay for the Asian Peace Program at the NUS to say, hey, let's just install virtual sensors at the border so that Indian and Chinese soldiers don't have to face each other face to face. We can use technology in a positive way. The third structural force going to bring about the deterioration in China-India relations is a completely different geopolitical context that we have today. You know, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh was very close to President Bush, President Obama. Prime Minister Modi is close to President Donald Trump. And that relationship didn't cause any discomfort before. But in the last 2 years, as I document in my book, Has China Won?, the United States has launched a major geopolitical contest against China. It's off, it's taken off. So every signal now is in a different context. So for example, India has the absolute sovereign right to join the Quad. It has a sovereign right to do so, but it sends a geopolitical signal at the same time. So it's important to understand clinically and dispassionately what these geopolitical signals mean. And to give you another example, fourth structural force, China has launched the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, it's a very long, complicated story why it launched it, but it has a geopolitical dimension. The Chinese anticipated that the United States would someday stand up, as it did, to try and stop China from rising, maybe contain China. So the Belt and Road Initiative has got economic reasons, but it's a geopolitical initiative also to get China engaged with all its neighbors. Well, some of China's neighbors are also India's neighbors. So China's relations with Bangladesh, with Nepal, with Sri Lanka have gone up. And the Indians suddenly feel, hey, why are you in my neighborhood? So you can see the Chinese have launched an initiative for their geopolitical reasons. India says this is threatening me. And I must say, to be fair, the Chinese could have shown more sensitivity before they entered into India's neighborhood. They should have realized, obviously, this is going to cause alarms. So the Chinese have made mistakes also in their dealings with India. And of course, I have in China-India relations, which is Pakistan. That will remain a major issue. The last thing I'm going to mention very quickly is that surprisingly, one other force that is now dividing China and India even more is culture. They have lived with each other for thousands of years, but they live in worlds apart and don't understand each other, which is why it's very sad that the Nalanda project that Amartya Sen set up to try and remind China and India how they used to come together in the year 800, 1200 years ago, that project is dying. A sort of symbolic indicator that culturally things are not going well. So the final point I'm going to ask, is it all gloom and doom? I fear it's going to be gloom and doom, but still it is possible to reverse this downslide if both sides stop being emotional and start looking at the whole picture and see what are the areas where China and India can really collaborate. The biggest priority is poverty reduction. That's the most important thing. That's where China and India can work together. Then you have global warming. China and India also have common interests over there. And if you look at technology, which is sadly where you're seeing the banning of Chinese firms and so on and so forth, does it help the man in the street if you react emotionally to these things? So that's why, frankly, ironically, even though, to be quite frank, things will definitely, almost definitely get worse within China and India, it could not be a more timely moment for Lee Kuan Yew School to come up with this book. Because I believe, and this is what I hope that the policymakers will do at the end of the day. They will step back from their emotional drives, study China-India relations clinically, dispassionately. And this book is a tremendous guide for working that out. And then sit back and say, okay, how do we get along with each other? How do we develop a positive sum game between China and India? And I can tell you, if China and India can do that, the rest of Asia is going to cheer. Because there's nothing more saddening to be an Asian and to see the two largest Asian nations literally fight each other with fists and kill each other. That's truly sad. And that's depressed Asia. And this is why I hope that this book will have a positive effect and all these clashes will stop, and maybe China and India can learn to live in peace with each other again. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much, Kishore. That was a suitably chastening but wide-ranging introduction. So much appreciate that. Now let's turn to the three co-editors of this volume. So I think we're going to ask Selina, Professor Selina Ho, to speak first, and then hand over to her co-editors. So Selina, do you want to tell us a little bit about the context of editing the book and what you take out of it?
Thank you, James, and welcome everyone. And it's very nice to have you all with us today. Thank you, Kishore, for your remarks and also for sharing with us your insights and also your plug for the book. Thank you. It is with great pleasure that I'm actually representing my co-editors today, Kanti Bajpai and Marjorie Chatterjee Miller, to introduce the book. The Handbook actually started as a project in 2018 when Kanti and Routledge first brainstormed the idea of Handbook on China-India relations. And Kanti reached out to Marjorie and I. Very kindly he did so, and we got on board as co-editors. We were all really excited that we had a chance to produce what could be a defining book to understand this very important but rather underexplored relationship. And Marjorie, she was with us at the LKY school in the summer of 2018. She accepted our invitation to be with us at that time. And the visit really helped our collaboration. I remember that we had some really interesting discussions at that point. I'm glad though that as our discussions proceeded, we share a common vision. And this vision for the handbook is that we wanted diversity, depth, as well as breadth. And I think I'm pleased to say that we actually got all of that. I think you can see on the slide now some information on the book. And I think James will highlight that again later on. The book has 35 chapters written by 40 authors, and it takes a multidisciplinary approach to China-India relations with authors from many different backgrounds. We have both junior and senior scholars. We also have people, authors from both policy and academic backgrounds. It is also very diverse in multiple ways. We have authors from China and India, of course, but also from different parts of the world, from Singapore, from Europe, from Latin America, from the United States, from Taiwan, Japan, and Australia. And we also work hard to ensure something that's very important today is that the gender balance of the authors. About 40% of the authors are women scholars. I think this is a huge, remarkable achievement. And it goes to show that if you really look for it, you look for women scholars, you can find them, okay? All of us were mindful and very keen on achieving this balance. So the handbook stands out in many ways because of the diversity in disciplines, the seniority, and also junior scholars being brought in, different backgrounds, different regions of the world, and the gender balance of the handbook. Let me introduce some aspects of the handbook itself, the contents of the handbook. It covers a whole range of issues in China-India relations, from history and culture to bilateral conflicts, military and economic relations, the impact of third countries, as well as their visions of global order. It stands out among books on China-India relations because the handbook is also comparative, and particularly we will hear from Tarun Khanna later on. His chapter in the book is comparative from a business perspective, and as well in varying degrees, we have chapters from Courtney Fung, Orina Scala, and Azan Tarapo, as well as Laura Salmon and Ye Ming, among others. Their chapters are comparative as well. The other way that the book stands out is because we devoted an entire section to their historical and cultural ties going back to ancient times, including a wonderful chapter by Rudolf Wagner, who passed away last year. We felt strongly that to understand China-India relations, we need to understand the long story of these two ancient civilizations. The other way that the handbook stands out is because it emphasizes culture and social ties, which are often missed out in contemporary works on China-India relations. Finally, the handbook has come at a particularly critical point, which I think Kishore mentioned just now. We are facing a very tense period in China-India relations, one of the lowest point in their relations in decades. We, of course, when we produced the book, we couldn't have anticipated that. But nevertheless, I think from the document sent off in 2017, we should probably not be surprised that something like that has happened. In any case, we're glad that the handbook will be useful now at a time when policymakers and scholars are searching for a way forward in maintaining peace in China-India relations. The book is relevant in these times in at least two aspects. Firstly, it provides a very comprehensive and holistic picture of China-India relations. We should not look at the border dispute as the only thing in the relationship. And the border dispute itself is not just a military and security issues. And we have authors that talk about the border dispute. We have Taylor Fravel, Rishika Chandan, Fang Tiansi, who wrote wonderful chapters on the border dispute. We have authors who wrote on the military as well. But the handbook really shows you that the border disputes interwoven with a whole host of other issues, including historical issues, relations with Pakistan, competition for resources, for example, in the Brahmaputra River, as well as the two countries' competing visions of a world order. Well, in highlighting the complexity of these issues, and therefore the need to understand this context of the problems between the two countries, we hope that the handbook can in some way contribute to peace towards them, between them, which brings me to my second important point. Despite the low point in relations between and the trust deficit between the two countries, the handbook shows that China-India actually has a lot of complementary and cooperation between them. Tencent Sen's chapter shows a very deep political, cultural, and economic interactions between the two societies from 1937 to 1949. In the economic relations as well, we find a lot of cooperation between them, but the picture is also mixed in economics, right? If we look at the chapters on connectivity, and we have two, those chapters present a more mixed picture. So that the emphasis here is that we want to have a holistic look. We want to understand the context that we're in. We need to understand that the dispute with them is not the defining thing in their relationship. There are other aspects of their relationship. Now, all in all, my co-editors and I would like to thank the authors of the handbook. We couldn't get everyone to speak today because there are 40 authors. We are very grateful for their stellar contributions. We also thank our advisory council, and we have Shanting Li from our advisory council speaking to us today as well. In particular, among our advisory council members, I would like to mention Professor Rod McFarquhar, who passed away this year and whom we fondly remember at this time. Now, the book is actually dedicated to Rod and to Rodolphe Wagner. We hope that the handbook, which has been described very nicely by one of the authors as a labor of love, will be useful for as many of us, as many of you as possible, policymakers, scholars, and students alike. Although, you know, for Marjorie, Kanti, and I, in our own individual work, we're not as sanguine as we would like to be in our assessment of this very, very complex relationship. We nevertheless hope that peace will prevail, for the cost of conflict will be too high for both countries, for the region, and the world. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I look forward to the discussion later. I think Kanti will speak next, right, Kanti?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Selena, and it's really a great pleasure to do this. I'm very grateful to Selena. She's so wonderfully summarized the context and the content of the book as well. I really just want to thank a whole bunch of people and say one word about the book. The book came out of a project at the Center on Asia and Globalization, of which I'm director, which is one of the research centers at the Kuan School of Public Policy at NUS, at the National University of Singapore. Funding for my fellow authors, we were able to pay them a little bit for their contributions, came from Wilmar International, a company in Singapore, and I'm very grateful to Mr. Kwok, who heads the company and who's always shown great enthusiasm for Singapore's role in fostering thinking and dialogue between China and India. But let me thank others, of course, the authors. They put up with us for a couple of years and with great patience. To my fellow editors, of course, who very keenly and enthusiastically joined me in this book. And it's always a challenge for three people to work on a common project, but they were fantastic and I'm truly grateful. I want to thank also Routledge UK, and in particular, Alexandra Dubrow, who may or may not be on this session, who worked with us throughout. I particularly though want to thank Byron Chong, our RA at the Center on Asia and Globalization, who coordinated and who did a spectacular amount of editing for the book, as well as Libby Morgan Berry, who's now in the United States, who did a lot of the proofreading for, it's 600 pages long. That's a lot of editing, as you can imagine. Lastly, of course, thank also the administrative staff at my center, both Esther and Serene, who are fantastic support. As you heard, the Mittal Institute at Harvard and its director, Tarun Khanna, are partnering us tonight and have been very, very enthusiastic and cooperative in setting this up. And great thanks to you, Tarun, and for your colleagues in making this happen. Our aim was to bring a diverse group of people together, authors, as Selina mentioned. I just wanted to add that we wanted to enlarge the conversation on India-China relations between a lot of very familiar, very authoritative, wide-thinking people in both countries and elsewhere who write pretty regularly on India-China issues. And so we have some of them here. When you look at the contents, you will see them. But we also have been in touch with a much wider range of scholars who sometimes do China-India, sometimes don't, but who are moved to and who have really, I think, added great wisdom and insight. So I'm very glad if this book enlarges the space within which scholars discuss this, and the balance we've got between very recognized voices and a fresher set of voices to the discussion, I think is a signal part of the volume. As far as I know, there is no volume to compare at the moment. I hope there will be wonderful volumes after this. And I really want to thank Dorothea Schefter of Routledge, who spotted the opportunity and the need to do this book. So thank you, Dorothea, if you're listening. We're very happy with the outcome and hope that in these challenging times for India-China relations, as Kishore said, and as Selina underlined, the book will provide a cool-headed and informative view of the relationship. So with that, let me stop and look forward to participating in the discussion. Thanks very much.
Very good. Thanks, Kanti. Marjorie, do you want to take over from here for the trio of editors?
Sure. I think Kanti and Selina have really put it beautifully, but I'll go for a few seconds. I will say that a book like this is very hard to pull off unless you have a really good relationship with your co-editors. This is just so expansive. I'm not sure that when we even began talking about it, we had realized, how expansive it became. And I think that's actually very key to the India-China relationship in general. We talk about the border issue. If you open up the Indian newspapers today, you will see that front and central in the headline news. But in fact, the relationship is much more than that, as Selina has pointed out, and that the handbook actually reflects that. And so the fact that we had all of these chapters is really, an outcome that I'm not even sure we expected initially going in, as we brainstormed this. So for that alone, I would say I just so enjoyed working with Selina and Kanti. This has been really, really fantastic, and the product of very stimulating discussions. And as Kanti mentioned, we had wonderful contributors, known experts, but also fresh faces, which was also brought just new voices, and new voices in the relationship are always important. And finally, I'd just like to say a very quick word about the two men to whom this book is dedicated, Rod McFarker and Rudolf Wagner. Rod is one of the two reasons I began studying China. I mean, he and Rudolf were what we consider true China hands. They formed their career as sinologists, and Rod agreed to be on our board, and Rudolf contributed a wonderful chapter on pre-1939 Chinese views of India, which was fascinating. And it was just such a great loss that they both passed as the book came out and did not get to see it in print. But I'm very grateful for people like them, because they paved the way for understanding China and understanding China-India. Because in addition to being a sinologist, Rod was also an Indologist. So that path was blazed by people like them. And then we have moved forward, and we hope that this handbook, is a precedent for many more to come. Hopefully it will not be unique for very many more years, and people will take up the mantle and produce more books that are as comprehensive as this. And I'll just stop here. Thank you very much for being here today.
Very good. Thank you for that. We'll say, well, congratulations to the three of you. And indeed, if any of the other authors are joining us this evening, congratulations to those who've written for the book. Now, so let's continue the kind of broader discussion that Kishore began about the nature and outlook for China-India relations. And so to give a bit more perspective on that, we have coming second, Tarun Khanna, who wrote a chapter in the book, and first, Professor Shinding Li, who is on the advisory council of the scholars who helped guide this book. So I'm going to turn to Professor Shen first to give us a sense of how India-China relations look from the Chinese side. So Professor Shen, over to you.
Well, thank you for inviting me to this event. And also I am honored to be a part of the advisory council. As Kishore has mentioned, I'm also very sad to see China, India, the two great civilizations that used to launch the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, vowing to use political means, to use non-allies to help resolve those interstate dispute. But unfortunately, in their bordering area, the two countries witnessed 3 waves of clashes this year, with the second wave very tragic for both countries to lose the life of their young people. I'm very sad to see Indian armed force to lose their life. Chinese government has not announced the situation about our military. I presume China has also incurred some casualty. I'm also sad for this. This handbook, I think it's a huge encyclopedia, which fit for many people. For academic, this is a great compilation of the most fresh analysis with many top-notch scholars. So it's easier to consult one book for many issues. And you can expand your reading from this handbook to other volumes. For graduate school, for students, for many non-scholars, this huge encyclopedia is also very good for them to understand what's the reason why it happened. The book has many chapters analyzing China-India's relationship during the Republic of China period and during the People's Republic of China time, covering their foreign relationship, their cultural, economic engagement, and many are interested in their strategic and security relationship, covering the border issues. I think I would recommend Fudan University, the main library and many departments to buy it. I would recommend. And many scholars of our own Center for South Asian Study need to keep such a book for our daily consulting. One issue I would particularly point is, I don't think it's hopeful to resolve China-Indian border issue because we have national interest. And we have competing national interest with the notion the bigger is better. The wider territory is better. We don't have, unfortunately, a notion the smaller is better. China has its own national memory and India has its own national narrative that gives them the different understanding of the line of actual control. China wants to probably inching toward the Indian side, changing the status quo. And India may want to push back. As India said, this time India may have pushed toward the Chinese side by 4 kilometers. India is happy. And your happiness may be China's sadness. And China's happiness is your sadness. So we don't have a win-win, only zero-sum. Could we move beyond such a zero-sum Cold War mentality toward a win-win. If we don't get a win-win, at least I can learn some experience from what the Korean Peninsula has offered to us. The demilitarization zone, DMZ, or peace zone, or no war zone. China, India now have their security and confidence building measure. Don't bring weapon, don't shoot a bullet when they patrol are on the move. When the two patrol meet, they are not banned to use their fist and a rod to beat each other, but they are not allowed to shoot a bullet. Could they possibly not meet each other? By defining what is China's furthest definition of the line of actual control that India firmly disagree, and what is India's furthest line of actual control that China would disagree. To make such a two line and to define the area of dispute, and also make an accord, total withdrawal of any armed force from the zone, with our respective drone and satellites and international system to verify. There will be no verification. This is what South Korea and North Korea are doing successfully over the last 70, 80 years. Why India and China cannot learn from the experience of the two Koreans? Total withdrawal, and also leave some leeway. I think we can negotiate, and no one would lose, because China would withdraw from what India has defined, and India would withdraw from what China has defined. So why I warmly embrace this handbook, I'm already thinking about the second edition of this handbook. And I would volunteer to write a chapter on not fixing the border problem, but to manage the problem in a peaceful manner. So no one would lose, and everyone would benefit. So this is how I would tell this audience. India and China have great wisdom. They share not only flourish in their past, beating the colonizer, the common enemy, Britain, but also they shall be able to unite with Britain to make an Indian-Britain friendship and China-Britain partnership, but also China-India permanent, enduring partnership. We may never able to resolve the border issue, but we should absolutely be able to make it happen. Peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Shen. I'm sure we'll share that, that thought. And Tarun, so in addition, as I said, to your institute at Harvard kindly collaborating on this event, you wrote a chapter in the book and have written on China and India for many years, including your 2008 book on the two countries' entrepreneurial culture, many billions of entrepreneurs. So maybe you could bring in a sort of view on the economic relationship as much as the security relationship. And let me hand over to you.
Thank you, James, and thank you, everybody, and good evening to you all. It's morning in Boston, where I am. You know, it was an absolute pleasure to be invited to participate in the in writing a chapter for the book. I greatly enjoyed that and appreciated the input from the editors. It's an amazing accomplishment, so please let me add my congratulations to you all. And thank you also to the Lee Kuan Yew School for partnering with the institute that I run at Harvard. You know, the remembrances of Rod and Rudolph reminded me that Rod was one of the people who took me aside. You know, I have no background in international relations whatsoever. I'm an applied mathematician by training who's meandered into issues of, how would I phrase it, entrepreneur-centric economic development. And Rod took me aside and said that Harvard really needed to build an institute for South Asia. And that's how the South Asia Institute, he was one of the few voices, came into being. And 10 years later, very pleased to say that it's one of the biggest and most vibrant at Harvard, if I'm allowed to make that small boast on the part of my colleagues and myself. Interestingly, apropos the China-India collaborations, we have a very deep-seated collaboration now with the Fairbank Institute of Chinese Studies at Harvard and the Mittal Institute of South Asian Studies, which is on a forthcoming volume on the idea of meritocracy through the centuries in China and India up to the current time. I just mentioned that because we all remain committed to intellectual collaboration, which I think ultimately is going to be the basis for a sustained understanding between the two societies. And I want to echo both Professor Dingley's comments and my old friend Kishore's comments on that front, that somehow creating the preconditions for collaboration are really important. I thought I would just make two very small points. Professor Dingley's comments on the short-run need for de-escalation strikes me as eminently sensible. As Kishore was saying in his opening remarks, emotions are so high that if I wear my practical hat as an entrepreneur as opposed to my idealist hat as an academic, I would say that de-escalation is the best that we can hope for in the short run, and to create the preconditions so that more meaningful clinical conversations could occur in the longer run. However, in the longer run, as I reflected in my opening chapter to this wonderful, wonderful book, when I think back to when I started studying China and India comparatively in the mid-90s, and then wrote the book that James just referred to, Billions of Entrepreneurs, in 2008, I basically made two overarching statements. One, that even when you look at the development trajectories of the two countries, there are sustained differences in the paths taken, and that I did not see any prospect for any even partial convergence of those paths in the foreseeable future. On that dimension, I'm quite happy to defend that claim and declare victory, so to speak, and say that I was completely right. On the other, I was completely wrong. The second part of my claim was that that rational introspection would take over, and the many, many possibilities for symbioses, which are made all the more greater by the fact that the two trajectories are so different, creates many, many possibilities for win-win. And in the own research projects that I've done, both in China and India with my Chinese and Indian students, and in the companies that I've created that leverage the China-India differences, I think I'm able to see in a very practical way both scholarly and practical economic gains from this collaboration. Unfortunately, I was completely wrong in thinking that I could see this happen at a more systemic level. If anything, things have gone the other way. Perhaps realpolitik has kicked in. As Kishore said, size matters. And that collaboration has not been forthcoming, and the border tensions are now causing a retreat from that. Nonetheless, I think it's important to say, particularly as an academic, that the preconditions for collaboration remain as strong as ever. The fundamentals are still there. The two economies are still on different paths, meaning that they have complementary strengths that they can leverage if they're smart about it. And again, the big problems that we need to deal with, whether it's problems about water, an emerging flashpoint between the two countries soon, problems regarding global warming, etc. Those remain as important avenues for action as they've ever been before. So here's hoping for de-escalation in the short run. It's lovely to hear of Kanti's essays with censors and Professor Dingley's suggestion of a DMZ zone between the two countries. And here's hoping for longer run collaboration. And indeed, I echo the admonition to the editors that you should be preparing for a second edition. And thank you very much for both the institutional collaboration with Harvard and NUS, and also for the amazing opportunity to participate in this conversation. Back to James.
Very good. Thank you very much. I'm not sure how the three editors are feeling about all of this pressure to produce another volume, having just done this one, but maybe maybe they're so eager for more huge volumes. We've got a good number of questions now, so thank you very much. So many, I think we won't be able to get through all of them, but we're going to try and get through as many as we can in the half hour we've got left. But let me just ask a few questions to set things off. Kishore, if I could go back to you, let's sort of pull back to the furthest sort of distance away. You have always been a great optimist about the Asian century and the rise of Asia. Singapore's PM Lee recently wrote an article in Foreign Affairs magazine in which he worried about the future of US-China competition and said that if this went wrong, the Asian century was at risk. You're now sounding very pessimistic about India-China tensions. Does this, in a sense, what is the consequence for Asia that you see from the prognosis that you've outlined? And then after you've given us a sense of that, maybe we can talk a little bit about the current moment with the panelists. So Kishore, can I turn to you?
Well, the one thing I learned as I get older, that life is never a straightforward upwards line. There are always bumps on the road. And there were always, I mean, the US-China geopolitical contest was in some way inevitable. But I must say that the China-India geopolitical contest was not inevitable, and certainly not at this time. The timing is all wrong because neither China nor India have made it yet. And frankly, the priorities for China and India should be domestic. And basically both of them should be focusing on their own economic development and not get involved in these disputes. And as you know, the Chinese had a philosophy that Deng Xiaoping gave them, which is that, hey, we got to swallow bitter humiliation. It's okay, we just got to focus on getting, developing and getting ahead and so on and so forth. And by doing that, the Chinese, as you know, have become remarkably successful and have emerged as a major challenger to the United States. So these geopolitical contests in some cases were predictable, but in terms of the overall economic development of Asia, will this mean that the Asian century is over? The answer is no. And actually, in many ways, geopolitical competition actually enhances a lot of economic opportunities. And just give you one simple case study. The United States is putting pressure to reduce investment in China. Companies are reducing their manufacturing in China. They want to hedge their bets and manufacture elsewhere. Where are they going? They're going to ASEAN. So the investment in ASEAN will go up as a result of investment pulling out of China. But what's the net result of that? The ASEAN markets become bigger, and the number one trading partner of ASEAN is China. So what seems to be a zero-sum game actually ends up as a positive-sum game, and the economic growth of China and ASEAN will continue. And it's also important, just in one word, things like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and the TPP, the CPP-TPP, have to carry on. And I believe that they will carry on, and therefore the economic trajectory of growth in Asia will not be derailed.
Very good. Okay, I'm glad to see that you maintain your overall optimism, even with a small dose of pessimism. So we've had a lot of questions, and probably the most honest question is from Louis Tan, who says, exactly what is happening in the Himalayas? How much of this is foreign media sensationalism creating angst and anger in India? I mean, Kanti, I wonder, could I just, for those in the audience who are not close followers of what's happening at the moment in the last few days, could you sort of bring us up to date? And could I ask a sort of supplementary question, which is, in the aftermath of the original incident in the Galwan Valley a couple of months ago and post-COVID-19, a lot of people have in a sense been saying that this is a permanent shift in a kind of negative turn in India-China relations. But I wondered whether you agreed with that, or if you thought that, you know, this was, as Kishore said, ups and downs, and so we're going down at the moment, but maybe things will improve and this isn't necessarily as bad as it looks.
Well, on the first point, I mean, thanks, James. The last few days has seen, I've seen a push on both sides, it would seem. I mean, it's not terribly clear, and I made a pitch earlier in a different essay for better reconnaissance and surveillance remotely, and perhaps that would have helped in clearing up for the ordinary public and others a sense of what's really going on there. But it would seem that again there have been some ingresses and counter moves by China and India. Who started what is exactly not clear at this point. I mean, both have accused the other side of initiating the problem. And it's in the Pangong Lake area where the Indians now think they're on the heights looking down at Chinese positions and saying that, the Chinese made some moves which they've preempted. The Chinese have responded by saying, well, if you preempted, that suggests that you made the first move. So again, I think one of the things that's really come out of the last 3 or 4 months is that despite the many years of dialogue, the many systems of dialogue and confidence building they put together, it's quite striking how little they can actually agree on anything in the midst of this crisis. So the very tools that were put together to try and avoid this kind of situation, and then if it happened, to have mechanisms for dialogue, they seem to be failing in this situation. And so things remain very unclear with a lot of mutual recriminations and no agreement. This is somewhat reminiscent of 1962. I won't say a great deal more about that, but what's striking in the period, particularly 1959 to 1962, is they pretty much couldn't agree on anything. The alignment of the border, how it ought to be dealt with, standstill, interim confidence building measures, whether to even meet and carry on a dialogue that would solve the problem or build confidence. So I think that's the very striking problem here. Overall, is it going to get worse or is it going to get better? That's a bit mysterious, but I think there are some signs that I agree with Kishore that even in the short term, it could get worse. Just very briefly, I mean, General Rawat, the Chief of Defense Staff in India, said a few days ago that India would be prepared to use force if dialogue didn't work in restoring the status quo ante. And I think that has probably been noted in China. And then we've had these moves in the Pangong Lake area. So now whether those two things are quite related or not is not clear, but they could be. And so I think we're in a very, in a period laden with friction and some very dark clouds.
Very good. So we had a question from Rosemary Foote from Oxford University, which I think will work well both for our editors and for Professor Shen. So let me just read this out. It said, thanks very much to the editors and contributors. My question relates to the domestic political environment in both countries, the rise of nationalism, the emotionalism, as Kishore mentioned, embedded in the border issue and now the bilateral relationship as a whole. She says this restricts the room for policy maneuvers, and so asks, is it the domestic level that matters more in determining the levels of conflict rather than these more structural issues? So Professor Shen, could I pose that question first to you, and in a sense ask you to give the audience a sense of how this current moment of deterioration looks from China, seen from the Indian side. People seem to say, well, this is all about Chinese aggression, but seen from the Chinese side, I'm sure it doesn't look like that. So perhaps could you explain a little bit of the Chinese thinking here?
I would admit that these days with the availability of internet, WeChat chat room, people have more chance to access to information and also to offer their view. And oftentimes these views are partial and nationalistic, unhealthy. So China has a way to the government could manage it. Don't leak information. How many Chinese military people may have lost their life? Maybe Indian side 20, Chinese side 50. If we leak the data, Chinese people must be angry, pushing our government to beat India. We want to make a temperature to cool, not to be high. But the public would feel angry. Why Indian kill 50 Chinese? But if we leak the other kind of data, which is genuine, only 5 Chinese lost their life. China are still unhappy, but they are much happier than India would be, because we have far lower number of casualties. So whichever low number of casualty or high number of casualty, Chinese government decided not to leak, not to be pushed by the Chinese public, also not to push the Indian public. This is a way Chinese side try to manage the public sentiment. Not all people agree or would appreciate in Chinese side, but I think this is quite effective in lowering the temperature in managing the current relationship. We understand that the Modi government face its own domestic pressure. With their Indian style of democracy, they have multiple parties, different voices, and many freedom of the media. So the government must be under lots of pressure, and they have to represent the public view. And China may understand. We have our diplomats, our scholars in India, and I personally travel to India often. We would tell our government, don't respond in kind, tit for tat for India. We should be quiet. We should be more sensible, and we don't need to strike back exactly as India would be against us. But for the third wave, recent China-Indian clash, Indian side announced first before Chinese side would leak the information. They observed the Chinese side want to do something, and they take the preemption. So the Indian side justified their action because China was spotted to do something. So they did it before China would do. This may justify, but this has also been picked up by Chinese media and Chinese public. Look, they did it before we did. So our side actually are not informed by our government what happened. Our government did not leak the video. Indian side, we had to see the video from the Indian publishing, for which I appreciate. I also hope my government would publish our taking of the video, but they may unfortunately push China-Indian relationship even worse. So this is how I take for the domestic pressure for its impact on our foreign relationship, especially between China and India. This is a very crucial and sensitive time. I hope both governments would take maximum restraint. We have the military to military flag meeting. Each side, when they have a flag, they make a phone call. The two sides should not to fight. They should give some time for the command to meet and to find a solution. So we still have the working mechanisms, but that is not enough because each side can excuse why you would do the same. I hope both countries would make their maximum self-restraint. Don't push the envelope. Don't push the envelope. And also find a way how to back off, retreat from what we have already obtained. Chinese side, could we retreat from the high mountain? Then India would retreat from its own high mountain, which it has paid a great effort to take. Both sides retreat, rather than to push the envelope to move further forward, that inevitably would create next wave of clash. That may not be done by the fist, may be done by the weapon, which I would feel very sad, even more sad than what has happened.
Marjorie, I wondered if you wanted to comment on this, and we've had a couple of questions as well about the way that China and India behave in multilateral organizations. And I suppose the argument that the three of you made in your introduction was a little bit less gloomy than Kishore. You were not sanguine about the conflict, but you saw some scope for cooperation. I wonder if in the months since you wrote your introduction, in a sense, the current difficulties now make that cooperation less likely, or whether you're still reasonably optimistic that there are areas where India and China can cooperate. So Marjorie, maybe I could turn to you next.
Sure, thank you, James, and thank you, Professor Shandingli. I too, I share your concern, and I'm very worried about the relationship. And just going back to Professor Foot's question, Professor Foot, thank you for being here today. She is also on our advisory board for this book, and we're very grateful to her. I do think nationalism matters a lot in India and China. I'm not sure the domestic factors are more important, but they certainly do carry a weight, and they constrain the governments. And in India's case, control of information is difficult. It's a vibrant democracy. And so there is, a more natural spread of information as well as misinformation through the medium like Twitter and WhatsApp. So definitely that comes back to constrain the government. And I think one of the saddest things is that overwhelmingly for many years now, Pew polls show that the Indian public holds an overwhelmingly negative view of China. And that's been the case for a very long time, and I haven't seen it changing. So issues like this tend to cement that and make it even more hawkish and bring out the hawks in higher droves, which then in turn limits how the government can respond. And so that's a very big concern. However, I am still optimistic about the relationship simply because we know that cooperation does and can occur in many areas. I think Julie Klinger's chapter in our book on outer space cooperation, something we rarely read or hear about, is very interesting in how both India and China have adhered to a global commons and shared norms on it. The bilateral trade relationship is incredibly important as well, as I think has been pointed out. So there is ample scope for cooperation. And unfortunately, what happens is that when you have the border issue, that has always been very central to the relationship. But then when you have a crisis, that kind of overshadows the other areas of cooperation that do exist and should be allowed to flourish. And that's what we see today. And I'll just stop there and turn back to James.
So, Selena, did you have a point to add on here?
I was about to jump in on this aspect about the Chinese domestic politics side. Professor Food, that was a great question because I'm a great believer that Chinese foreign policy is driven very much by domestic interest and domestic politics. But I mean, my fellow panelists have talked about nationalism, but I actually want to refer to leadership politics right now because I think that one of the things that have been missing in a lot of analysis on why is China doing this, why is it going so aggressive and all that. I think one of the things that people don't pay enough attention to is that we see Xi Jinping and his agenda, right? I mean, the plenum is coming up. In 2022, the big question remains whether he's going to be extending beyond 2 terms. And if he wants to consolidate his power right now, well, yeah, I mean, he has to start consolidating and making sure that he gets over, he continues after 2022. And the plenum is coming up in October. I think one of the things that he cannot afford to look weak on the international stage. I mean, there has to be some show of strength against what the Chinese have been considering provocations along the border related to what Jammu and Kashmir and road buildings in the Ladakh area. So all these will play into the decisions to take certain actions, I think, across the border on the other side. I think that and I agree with Kanti, one of his pieces that he has written, that in a way, there have been provocations from the Indian side in terms of the domestic Jammu and Kashmir side. I mean, that's their internal politics, but from the Chinese perspective, they will look at it as certain forms of provocations. And the road buildings, it's India's every right to build roads within the area that it controls. But this would look like a challenge from the Chinese side. And I think the red line has been crossed in terms of territorial integrity, that's the core interest, the red line, and regime stability, they're all connected. So I think this is something that we have to consider. It is because it's puzzling, right? I mean, if you look at what's happening with the idea of the FOIP and with the Quad, we know that China has been looking at India as a, if I may say, a weak link in the Quad, in a sense that it doesn't share the same idea about FOIP that as containment. But, and it has always been careful not to push the Indians into the arms of the Americans. But, so why all these aggressive moves along the border, right? So I think it only makes sense if you look at it from domestic politics. We understand that that Xi is still in the process of consolidation. I mean, he has made great strides. The PLA and now the Ministry of State Security is calling him the people's leader, Renmin Xiu. So that makes a big difference, but he's still in the process. There are criticisms against him internally in that process, and I think that he needs to show a certain strength. He needs to consolidate. When red lines have been crossed, he needs to signal that. I think that we have to take that into consideration. James, thank you.
Very good. Well, I'll turn back. I'm afraid we've only got 10 minutes left, and we've got dozens of questions. So my apologies to those to whom we don't get to. But I wanted to, before we turn to this issue of China, India, and America, there was a question from our colleague Yongwook Ryu at the Lee Kuan Yew School, who asks about US-China in a different sense, about the trade war and the attempt to reorganize global supply chains, and whether India can play a role in replacing China as the factory of the world, and in a sense states India may gain a great deal from US-China competition. So I wondered, Tarun, could you talk to this for a minute? In a sense, how does India's, at the moment it doesn't appear that this is affecting India's thinking at all, because it's being reasonably aggressive, banning Chinese apps and all sorts of things. But how does India's economic position play into its actions as it thinks about its relationship with China?
So I think, as I was saying below, there is a danger of knee-jerk reactions, whether they are backfiring in some ways. I was disappointed to hear on both sides, all the escalating rhetoric, including on the Indian side, the escalating rhetoric against the apps and so on. But to the question that your colleague posed, James, I think there are some sectors in India where it's plausible that the Indian entrepreneurs, the Indian state could get its act together to being a very partial replacement for China. I think of, auto components, I think of medical devices and things of that nature. But in general, it's very hard to see India meaningfully filling that gap in the very short run. One of the speakers earlier, maybe it was Kishore, talked about how ASEAN might fill that gap in what turns out to be a win-win collaboration. That seems to be more likely. I think the focus in India at the current moment, I have a role as an advisor to the current administration. I should disclose that, is very much on building up the science infrastructure and the tech infrastructure of the country from ground up, because that, I think, is rightly seen as a source of long-run fundamental strength. In a sense, it's doing what a number of the panelists were talking about earlier, which is focus on the domestic economy, get things up and running, and whether that plays out productively in the global competition to attract capital and talent and so on will be seen in the fullness of time. But in the meantime, a game theorist would say it's a dominant strategy just to focus on your own house and fix the economic fundamentals. I think that's the priority, and that's what should be the priority of the Indian state currently.
Very good. I think that the sort of elephant in the room here is to look at how this plays with the United States. A number of questions have come in on this. I'll pick one from Anu Anwar, who's a fellow at the Harvard Asia Center. Would this Sino-Indian border clash be the tipping point for India to give up its historic non-alignment policy and move a step forward towards fully joining up with the Quad? Kishore, could you mentioned some of this in your introduction, and you were talking about the balance between India and China and the United States. I mean, could you, in a sense, talk us through how you see the relationship between the three big global powers complicating the relationship between India and China on their own?
Yes, I know we don't have much time, so I'll be very brief. There's absolutely no question that the US-China geopolitical contest is a factor in the China-India relationship. Let's be very clear about that. There's also no question that India's priority in Washington, D.C. has gone up tenfold because of the contest with China. And the United States is looking for countries to balance China. India seems like a perfect candidate, same size, same population, and so on and so forth. So the decision actually lies with India, whether or not it's in India's interest to join the US effort to counterbalance China. And here, since I don't have much time, my apologies, I'm going to be very blunt and very brief. It may be good for India to be more cunning in its calculations. Because when China engaged the United States in 1980 or 1970, United States was by far the most powerful country. It was rich, self-confident, generous, opened its markets, and so on and so forth. In 2020, the United States is very different. The United States cannot open up its economy and allow a flood of Indian products to come in. The United States can't even resume the H-1B workers that used to come from India. It's a different United States. So it requires a tremendous amount of geopolitical cunning in the part of India to figure out what is its best position to be in a very different context, a very different environment. And unfortunately in India, the geopolitical discussions have become so emotional that they don't realize that the biggest mistake you can make in geopolitics is to become emotional.
Maybe I could give the last word before we run out of time too. I'll let whichever of our three editors would like to speak on this, but I wonder if one of the three of you could either both reflect on this question, but of the US and China and India, but in a sense give us some more reasons for optimism. As I say in your introduction, you're admirably balanced and say that there's good reason to think that these two countries will end up cooperating in various different areas. And I wondered if you might just, in a sense, give us the most optimistic take that you can on the future of Sino-Indian relations to close. We started off gloomily with Kishore, but maybe we can go out with a kind of sliver of hope that things might turn out all right. So who would like to have a crack at that? Kanti, Marjorie, who amongst the editors shall have the last word?
Well, I'll have a very quick word. I think watch what S. Jayashankar is going to be saying later this evening. He's launching his book, The India Way. And he and the Prime Minister have been talking about India as a leading power. And if you read what Jayashankar particularly means by it, it sounds an awful lot like a sort of non-alignment, because what he's really talking about is India partnering, not so much the United States necessarily, but many of the old partners of India in the non-aligned movement in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and deploying what he calls, shaping power, basically, trying to configure norms and practices and institutions in the international system, allowing India to kind of then deal with Pakistan or China or other problems by defining a context within which China and Pakistan and others would then rethink the way they deal with India. So I think on the issue of India-US relationship, not so sure that Modi and Jayashankar are thinking about such a deep partnership with the United States as in an alliance. They seem to be carving out a space for something like a kind of new non-alignment, a new internationalism on India's part. And I'll hand over to Marjorie to maybe say something more optimistic about India-China, and of course to add her words on India and the United States.
Very good, Marjorie.
Well,
so I'll give the last the last word to you, because we said we'd wrap up at 9:45 Singapore time. So go ahead. Give us something optimistic to think about as we close.
Oh my gosh. That's huge pressure. I'm always optimistic about the China-India relationship. So, but that aside, I will say this, that I think the China, US, India, triangle that keeps coming up over and over again is analyzed in a much less nuanced way than it should be. So I think there are a few different things here. One is that I do think that China is more worried about Indian and US alignment, like strong, close alignment that it needs to be, right? So that is something that is clearly on China's mind. I do think that Kishore is right, that the United States has would very much like to use India to counterbalance China and has been moving in this direction. But I'll also say that the US has been trying that for a very long time. Right, so this is not new. This isn't with the Trump administration. It predates the Trump administration. You can actually go back to the later days of the Clinton administration onwards. Right, there's been this move to try and make India into this counterbalance. Where India stands on it is much more slippery, right? So India does want a partnership, but I don't see any. I agree with Kanti. I don't see any strong moves where this moves from a partnership to an alliance. And so to go back to this question of non-alignment, a couple of years ago, Kate Sullivan de Estrada at Oxford and I wrote this piece called Pragmatism in Indian Foreign Policy for International Affairs. And we talked about how ideas are really sticky. And so something like non-alignment, which is very deeply rooted in Indian foreign policy, is a very sticky norm, right? It's hard to shift it. And so even though India has stopped talking about non-alignment, in many ways you see that hold over. I mean, the current administration would definitely not want to talk about non-alignment. They don't want it to be seen as inheriting anything from the Congress government. But is that still a cornerstone of their foreign policy? Well, I haven't seen a huge shift away from that yet. And as Kanti pointed out, I think S. Jayashankar's book is definitely speaking to that without actually uttering the words non-alignment. So I think India is playing a much more slippery game than the United States would like, and then China realizes. And maybe that's the hope for optimism, right? That it's that there are no easy answers to this, but we cannot pin each of these countries into these neat geopolitical holes either, and think of conflict as inevitable. And I'll just
very good. Okay, thank you very much. So that was a sort of reasonable note of optimism on which to end. So thank you very much. So congratulations again to our three editors, to Kanti, Selina, and Marjorie. Many thanks in particular to Professor Shen Jinli and Tarun Khanna for joining us, and of course to Kishore for giving us that introduction. I should remind you that the book, if you can put the slide up again, somebody asked a question that they wanted to see the QR code, so you can get the book. It's 20% off, which that's a real bargain for anyone who wants to know everything about India-China relations. So you feel free to buy it, or our editors and their contributors will be very grateful. So thank you very much. My apologies to everybody who didn't get a question answered. But many thanks for chipping in. So thanks again for a stimulating and interesting evening.